So I'd like to switch back into English, I guess, and thank all the organizers for having me. I'm very aware of, returning to the English language just because I'm from Canada and it's a country where I guess people have actually retired or left their posts as CEOs because they did something completely in English. So I hope that's not something that happens to me today. But being Canadian, but also trained in the US, this is sort of an academic language that I'm very used to speaking, and even down to talking about something like the birth of is something that in sort of the milieu of American academia that I'm from, it's very influenced by this kind of 1960s Michel Foucault, French theory sort of branch of scholarship. And so I'm thinking about inequality from the standpoint of this. And I am not a statistician or a historian, but actually an STS scholar with very strong sort of political theory interests and leanings. And what I have been very interested in and is inequality is sort of an epistemic and social object. So what is this intersection between, on the one hand, all of these studies about inequality that emerged around, I guess, beginning in the early 2000s, but kind of peaking around the 2010s, and large scale social movements that took place around the world, such as the Occupy Wall Street movement, where people talked about themselves as being part of the 99%. So, really, an example where sort of the production of inequality statistics became part of people's identity to the point that they were saying they are the number behind the number, the 99%. So, this is something that's really interesting to me from the perspective of, well, what are these ways of understanding ourselves within society and in this prism of inequality? Why has it become, I think, to Permint's talk, something that it's talked about in the 1%? And I think Pierre Nicolas also mentioned that there are other inequality statistics. So why is it that this becomes the sort of principal representation of inequality? And it's also something that I find interesting. I mean, given the total success of the Piketty movement, which I probably don't need to introduce to people in this room, that there's still this discussion among them about sort of a statistical dark ages. So the idea is that we're living in the dark ages of inequality statistics. And then even after a decade of the Great Recession in the US, governments still aren't accurately tracking the evolution of income and wealth. So this is really a claim that sort of the levels of inequality in society, the richest 1% or 0.1%, aren't being tracked by governments, they're not being taxed by governments, and we need to do something about it. So from a 2019 article in Project Syndicate, you can easily find this. It's kind of the dark ages of inequality data, I believe, which I'm sort of contrasting with a project, I guess a way of talking about these things that I'm developing, which is really to understand inequality statistics, not simply as sort of marking a deficiency. So not that states aren't producing these data, but rather that what people like Piketty are trying to push for is sort of a vision of inequality that is the way of seeing, that is the sort of statistical institute like the one we're currently in. So how are we looking at inequality as sort of a product of a statistical distribution, a product of national statistics, and as a way of solving things that principally revolves around the state. So a status model of both looking at the problem of inequality and trying to stop it. So that's why I call it the statistical model of inequality, or statistical model of inequality. And there's a lot of literature on this within science and technology studies. So a colleague of mine at Cornell University, Dan Hirschman, who's working more from the sociology of science, talks about sort of the way in which we didn't actually produce these inequality statistics. And he talks about them and that these were kind of failed knowledge infrastructures, that we missed the growth of the top 1% for all these years. And he addresses it as a problem of labor economics. So survey methods weren't tracking changes in the extremes of the distribution. He also blames macroeconomics, that national accounts were examining, say, labor shares while ignoring the underlying distribution, and also to social science writ large. So we lacked easily available, standardized, and timely data. So it's really this story, I think, in line with the Piketty et al. Story that says, well, we haven't been able to see these things because we were relying on surveys. We weren't doing sort of distribution when it came to national accounts, and we weren't standardizing and doing the data in a timely way. So I'm problematizing this story in many ways. So while not being a historian, there are historical moments that are kind of interesting that will pop up in the talk. So hopefully you'll identify them, and I'm happy to sort of address them afterward. But The argument that I'm trying to make is not so much that this sort of reflects a deficiency in the National Statistics Institute, but rather that there's a sort of deep affinity that, in fact, the model for measuring and understanding inequality of the World Inequality Database is largely based on the sort of approach to measuring and observing inequality that the Insee developed since 1946, but also much earlier in earlier National Statistics Institute. So this idea that you generate data, you use it as a resource for studies that are being done by academics and other analysts, and that you're also informing public debate. I mean, I think this idea of contributing to a public debate is something that in my field work, when I was sort of shadowing Piketty at the Paris School of Economics, it would just come up again and again. I mean, the idea of a débat public, the idea of needing to contribute it as an academic. And this was kind of striking to me as coming from the US, where it's not often talked about in those terms. And I'll kind of get to that at the end. So trying to draw the parallel between the work of the Insee and the work of something like the World Inequality Database, the World Inequality Lab that's been around since 2011. So the idea is that this represents sort of modeled after the National Statistical Institute and also trying to extend its ways of looking at problems of inequality. And since we're in the Bibliothèque Alain de Rosière, I thought I'd go back to La Politique des Grands Nombres and try to understand some of the ways that he had of talking about statistics. And this is just from the portion where he's talking about French statistics, so not German or British, but rather sort of how statistical agencies emerged in France. And I kind of used three different verbs for talking about this so that the statistical agency demarcates things. It defines social categories, as Pierre Nicolas and others have been showing, but it's also the work of a strong centralized state. So it's kind of the state and its apparatus and its ways of knowing. The other thing that it does is it standardizes, so making judgments or measures that are the same across time and space, that are transportable, generalizable, and repeatable. And it centralizes, so it unifies all those measurements and puts them in what Bruno Latour calls a center of calculation. So a centralized location where all of the national territories are under the control of a centralized knowing state. So I think this last point is maybe the most distinctly like French about the sort of statistics that we'll be talking about. But I'm happy to also talk about that earlier. So with Insee and with the World Inequality Lab and the Piketty approach, I think what they're doing is not so much a sort of divergence, but it's rather a shift or a change in the things that are being demarcated. So away from an analysis of inequality in terms of the CSP, the socio-professional categories, towards an understanding of inequality in terms of fractals. So the top 1%, the top 0.1%, the top 0.01%, et cetera. Standardizing something different, so not national accounts, but rather what they call distributional national accounts. And third, trying to centralize, so moving from just the national state, so the National Statistical Office, to I think a more international model of statistics that would be applicable by the United Nations, by the European Union, and other very large bodies. So they kind of have a movement towards an international model, whether that's representative of the EU or of other transnational bodies. So in effect, it's extending the Insee project to a kind of international, globalized world. And again, I can come back to all of that and will. So to demarcate, as I think Pierre Nicolas was also mentioning, the socio-professional categories have existed as generated by the Insee since the 1950s. These are like the manœuvres, the ouvriers spécialisés, les ouvriers qualifiés, and the cadres. So these different categories along which we'd understand like portions of the income going to each specific one. So inequality was being measured, the amount of income that these groups were being received was measured. But as Piketty in his work on top revenues in France from 1999 in English, or actually I think it's 2001 in both in French, talks about the sort of that these aren't sort of appropriate for that these were seen as appropriate for understanding social inequalities. So the thing that these categories will help us get at are social conflicts that are understood by society, but they're not the sort of thing that a statistician or historian of Piketty's sort can actually work with. So the fractal for Piketty becomes the measure, and the way that he sort of demonstrates it in the very first graphic of this book, which some of you may know, is sort of looking at the category. So the classe moyenne understood as the fractal from 90 to the 95th percentile, and the 200 famille, the fractal from 99.99 to 100%. So I was really interested and struck when I saw this about the 200 famille, and I hadn't heard a category like that. I mean, I've heard of the Forbes 500, but I mean, I was interested just at what this actually was, and indeed, he's kind of wanting to understand inequality not as sort of across social categories, but instead across these different percentiles, and also to break it down between, say, capital and work. So the idea that you can actually differentiate morally different kinds of money that people are making, which would become later in his 2014 Capital in the 21st Century a very important part of his argument, because he's saying that, well, capital is now dominating work, and so we're living in this unequal society where inequalities are just going to be pushed further and further. And you can really see how the sort of graph is going up. And so we might be alarmed about inequalities once they're made visible in this way. But the World Inequality Lab is also, like the Insee, interested in standardization. So the way that de Rosière talks about this is in terms of the national accounts that were developed at Insee after the Second World War. This is a history all of you probably don't need to know, but in the 1960s, the association with planning and modeling of economic growth, but then also coupling it to this sort of idea that it was connected to egalitarian structures of the welfare state. So like how much money is going to all these different groups who are engaged in class conflict, understood in a sort of class conflictual way, and how the national account could be actually tied to that is sort of a question that only gets posed later by the Piketty and et al. Group. So they're very concerned about this gap between the national accounts, which focus on macro totals, and growth and inequality studies, which are focusing on the distributions using survey and tax data. So what they've invented, or how they're trying to extend the Insee approach with national accounts, or just of a national statistics office, since they all do these SNA or national accounts, is distribute the growth. So creating these distributional national accounts, which will provide estimates of the distribution of income and wealth using concepts that are consistent with macroeconomic totals. So taking all of the wealth and then creating a distribution that it could be made consistent with, so that when you look at it, it looks consistent with all the other data, the fiscal or survey data that you have, but then is also expressed in terms of the numbers of the national income, which allows you to say this much growth went to the top 1% in this particular year. So it's really about saying the size of the economy and how it's changing over time. So it gives you a sort of much closer look at how things are evolving, but then also distributing things like capital and labor more precisely. And finally, on this point of centralization, the Insee has produced sort of a statistical place for statistical formation and training, or at least where people who are statistically formed in a centralized way end up working. It integrates the state and statistical analysis, previously planning, and it sort of combines statistics and economic theory, which, as I understand, is not something that is as done in, say, American Statistical Institute. So again, it sets the context for public debate, but as Piketty has sort of argued, often sort of the things like the enquête revenus fiscaux, the ERF, that have been carried out at the Insee since 1956, these kind of become, or because of their centralization, became the unique source for talking about inequality. And as a result, they may be cannibalized other statistics that would be established by, say, fiscal administration. So looking at tax data as the principal source for inequality. So that's the story that he tells about it. But it's also the one that, as the World Inequality Lab and World Inequality Database have been talking about it, is part of this sort of project to inform public debate. So if we took all of the administrative fiscal data, if we took all of the survey data, if we made all of those as compatible and standardized as possible, we can inform the public debate. And I think every time I've seen one of these reports released, I mean, I think I was in India when the 2022 one came out, and it was an item in the news. It's like people were talking about inequalities in India as a result of this publication. So very influential in terms of informing a kind of global public debate about inequality. But again, I think it is interesting to me partly because it's, after all, the thing that Insee has always done. And so there's a question of what are they doing that's sort of different in terms of the centralization. And I'll go very quickly through this, but sort of what de Rosière talks about with this French statistical model. Again, kind of has different periods, pre-revolutionary, 19th century, and 20th century, which is what I'm most interested in. But the administration of an état-providence or état social, this idea of the welfare state being the thing, the social state being the thing that is being administered by these statistics. And it's a big part of the argument. This is from an article by Emmanuel Saez for the International Monetary Fund, which is looking at levels of inequality as they're evolving over time in these different countries. And it's very sorry, not the levels of inequality. This is the ratio of tax revenue to GDP. But the main idea is that you see France in this sort of light blue, which is something like over 50%, and then you see a country like the US is just sort of like limply going down at around like 30%. And I've always kind of found this figure really interesting because it really does speak to some of these cross-national differences that I'm interested in. So, the model of the social state is coming maybe more from social democratic or European social democracy as opposed to Anglo-Saxon or even American liberal democracy. And sort of what does this say about the project? So I think one thing that people might say about the Piketty-Saez project from the US perspective is that they're sort of interested in building this kind of global government. And I don't think it's wrong to say that they are. It's just that in order to actually track all of the wealth and standardize it across territory, you need a sort of global statistical apparatus, but you also need a global state that would actually rein in that wealth and rein in that inequality in a way that, as you can see, isn't sort of consonant across cultural contexts. But it's an interesting story, partly because it is one that Piketty sort of developed. I mean, he spent a couple years where I was trained in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and was working with sort of methods and approaches of Simon Kuznets, who, as everyone should know or it would know, is responsible for the early development of national accounts. But he's also quite known for the so-called Kuznets hypothesis, which says that inequality at early stages of economic development will actually start to go up, but eventually it will go down with more and more growth. So there's a question, I think, an empirical one about whether this is responsible for the apparent decline of interest in inequality statistics in the 20th century. Was it a story that American economists believed? Was there a reason for abandoning it? But it's also interesting because of how Piketty uses these methods and sort of resurrects them in the 21st century, late 20th century, to sort of talk about inequality again along the lines that he suggests. But it's also, I mean, the story that we didn't see inequality coming or know that it was coming, it isn't even true if you look at it from the U.S. perspective. So Paul Krugman, who's maybe the closest thing to an American public intellectual that we have, talks about sort of the idea of inequality rising among the 1% and the amount of growth that was going to those families, just using Congressional Budget Office data and writing about this in 1992. So economists were very aware that this problem was happening. They were interested in it, maybe less as a sort of problem of rising capital, which is the story that Piketty tells, but maybe more so as a question of wage dispersion. So why are wages starting to divert across the economic spectrum? And why is it that some families, the sort of richest families, are getting the majority of the growth? But I mean, some of the flavor of the American debate since that time has been a little bit different. So there was a major experiment conducted in the 1990s called Moving to Opportunity, which actually used not a sort of global distributional statistical approach, but actually a randomized control trial. So the idea is that you provide vouchers to very poor families and allow them to move to better neighborhoods. And in sort of American social science parlance, there's always been a sort of discussion of neighborhood effects and the idea that a large sum of inequality can sort of be explained by where you grew up. And this is really closely tied to racial differences in the United States. But it also has a kind of explanation in this framework that might be called like an opportunity approach. And so Claudia Golden and Larry Katz kind of provide the sort of framework for this, talking about it in terms of the race between education and technology. So the problem isn't inequality as such. The problem is that technology is developing at such a rapid pace and education is not being distributed quickly enough that the gap between the people who are really highly educated and can work with computers and go to Silicon Valley is growing between the rest of people or sort of being left behind this technological development. That's really interesting because it's actually the explanation that Kuznets favors. So Kuznets says that it's about the type of training or the fact that you're an industrial worker as opposed to an agricultural worker. That's what increases inequality at the very early stages of growth. And that over time, inequality will level out because technology sort of levels out across and access to technology levels out across the population. So this idea that it's sort of technology did it is different from, I think, the direction that Piketty takes the debate, because Piketty wants to say, no, it's not about technology. It's actually about social choices that people are making. It's about changes in policy. It's about norms. So Sayers and Piketty bring in all these explanations, which I haven't seen sort of picked up as much in the American debate, which is really sort of tied to these sort of naturalization of like technology and education as sort of the sort of primary movers of inequality. And I put Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo's book here because I do sort of see it in this lineage of seeing inequality, not in terms of sort of a global distribution, but rather in terms of individuals. How can you provide them levers and opportunities to escape poverty? Whereas it kind of leaves the problem of the top 5% sort of forgotten. So just to finish off very quickly, I guess coming back to Desrosiers' categories of demarcate, standardize, or decentralize, or my way of glossing over them. In this American approach, I've seen not sort of the National Statistical Office, but rather an effort to sort of identify individuals who are stuck in poverty and get them out of those poverty traps. There's more of an emphasis on sort of an experimental apparatus that can identify the causal treatments for inequality or poverty rather than describe the history of its evolution. Certainly, there isn't a discussion of capital as like sort of the main thing to blame for it. So, I don't think at 8 years of being at the Kennedy School, I don't think I ever heard people talk about capitalism as a begrip or a concept. So it's kind of interesting the extent to which capital can be used as a explanatory category in some contexts, but not others. But finally, a way of decentralizing the debate. So not turning it around what the state is doing, but rather these sort of more marginal micro interventions that can be conducted by the Ford Foundation or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which the US has like these huge amounts of philanthropy dollars, partly because, as you were saying with the GDP graphs, it's not taxing wealth or income at the level of like 50 or 60% of the gross revenue of the country, but rather they're sort of just pocketing it, and then the entrepreneur, so Bill Gates or even Elon Musk, gets to decide how it's spent. And a lot of the ways that America has had of fixing its welfare problems have gone around through the sort of private means as opposed to public. So this kind of gives you a sense of the statistical model that I was delineating using Desrosiers' categories and some of the differences that I see with this kind of more experimental approach to inequality as I'm talking about it. But I'll leave it with that. And I'll only quickly say that I'm not at the University of Potsdam. I'm at the Research Institute for Sustainability, but it's just a minor thing. But thank you.